Officer Kareth had felt wrong nights before. Every Valori who served long enough on a border station learned to trust that quiet static in the back of the skull, the sense that space itself had shifted, even before the instruments agreed. Tonight, the feeling arrived 3 minutes before the first alarm, and by the time the alarm finally screamed to the corridors of Meridian 7, Kareth was already standing at the console, hands hovering over controls that hadn't been touched in years. The vessel appeared on long-range scanners like a rumor that refused to go away. No transponder signal, no registered flight plan, no warning beacon of any kind. It moved through restricted space with a precision that unsettled every technician on duty, not the erratic drift of a smuggler trying to avoid detection, but the calm, deliberate path of someone that had already calculated every possible reaction the station could make, and simply didn't care. "Probably freight runners," said Ensign Dole, not quite believing his own words. Cutting through the corridor to save fuel. "We'll flag them, find them, move on." Kara said nothing. Something about the ship's silence didn't feel like evasion. It felt like patience. They ran the first scan, then a second, then a third, because the second scan produced a result that no one on the bridge wanted to say out loud. The hull composition, the drive signature, the architecture of the ship itself. Every marker pointed to the same impossible conclusion. Kara stared at the readout for a long moment before finally speaking the word that would end the illusion an entire generation had built its peace upon. Human. The bridge went silent in a way that had nothing to do with the vacuum outside. Every Coalition citizen alive today had grown up with the same comforting bedtime story, that humanity, chaotic and dangerous, had risen briefly, clashed with the Coalition in the conflict known only as the Kth Response, and then vanished, contained, quieted, erased from galactic relevance. 26 years of silence had calcified into certainty. Humanity was a closed chapter, a cautionary tale told to frighten cadets into obedience. And yet here was a ship, cold and precise, cutting through restricted space as though it had never once doubted it belonged there. Commander Sellett arrived on the bridge already half-dressed in uniform, her expression caught between irritation and the first threads of real alarm. She had commanded Meridian 7 for 6 years without a single incident worth writing home about. She had a feeling that streak was about to end violently. "Confirm the reading," she ordered. "I want to confirm 3 separate ways before I send this up the chain." They confirmed it 3 separate ways. The ship was human. There was no mistaking it now. Selleth opened a hailing frequency, her voice carrying the practiced calm of someone who had rehearsed first contact protocol 100 times without ever expecting to use it. "Unidentified vessel, you're entering restricted Coalition space. Identify yourself and state your intentions immediately." Silence. Not the silence of a malfunctioning receiver. Not the silence of distance and delay. A deliberate, chosen silence. The ship did not alter its course by so much as a degree. It did not slow. It did not accelerate. It simply continued forward, unbothered, as though the warning had been noted, filed away, and dismissed as irrelevant to whatever purpose had brought it here. "Send it again," Selleth said, full authority override. "Tell them we will not hesitate to." "Commander," Kareth's voice cut through the room, tight and urgent. "You need to see this." On the secondary display, a data pull from the station archives had returned something unexpected. Someone, Kareth wasn't yet sure who, had already tried searching the sealed Kth response files the moment the word human appeared on the primary scanner. The system had returned partial results before hitting its restriction wall, but what little slipped through was enough to plant a cold seed of doubt in Kareth's chest. The official Coalition record insisted, in every retelling, every history lesson, every solemn anniversary broadcast, that humanity had been defeated. But the sealed file, the actual sealed file buried beneath 26 years of careful narrative, used a different word entirely. Contained. Kareth read it twice, then a third time, waiting for the meaning to soften. It didn't. Selleth leaned over the console, and for the first time that night, her composure cracked just slightly at the edges. "That's not possible. The files were closed." "Verified. I read the summary myself during officer training." "You read the summary," Kareth said quietly, "not the file." Before either of them could process the implication, the sensor operator at the far station let out a strangled sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a curse. Every head on the bridge turned toward her station, where the long-range array had just finished a routine deep field recalibration, a scan that hadn't been run in months, triggered automatically by the anomaly alert. The screen filled, slowly, with new contacts. Not one ship, not two, 32, positioned at the very edge of sensor range, spaced with precision too exact to be coincidence, sat an entire fleet that Coalition scanners had, until this exact moment, dismissed as background interference, cosmic noise, the kind of ambient static every long-range operator learned to filter out and ignore. They were not hiding badly. They were hiding perfectly, and had chosen, for reasons no one on Meridian 7 yet understood, to stop. Sellers stared at the fleet readout, then at the single silent ship still gliding toward the station with unbothered calm, then at the word glowing accusingly on Karatha's screen. Contained. For 26 years, the galaxy had told itself a story about a defeated, vanished people. Standing on the bridge of Meridian 7, watching 32 ships emerge from a static that had never actually been static at all, Commander Seleth understood with sudden, sickening clarity that the story might have been written by the wrong side. The lone human ship crossed the final threshold into station range. And then, without warning, without static, without delay, a transmission opened on every channel at once. Clear, calm, and utterly unafraid. The silence was over. What came next would be far harder to ignore. Every officer on Meridian 7 would later remember exactly where they were standing when the transmission opened. It didn't crackle in through interference or arrive garbled by distance. It simply appeared, layered cleanly across every channel the station operated, as though the humans had been listening to Coalition communications long enough to know precisely how to speak, so they'd be heard. But the words hadn't come yet. First, there was only a tone. 3 descending notes, almost musical, functioning as nothing more than an announcement that someone intended to speak. And then, silence again, deliberate and unhurried, as if daring the Coalition to break first. Karath found a pause almost unbearable. Seleth did not. "Hold all outgoing transmissions," the commander ordered, her voice steady despite the tremor Karath had seen in her hands moments earlier. "Nobody responds until I say so. I want eyes on that fleet, full analysis, and I want the Kth response file, the real one, pulled up on my station in the next 2 minutes." That order proved harder to fulfill than anyone expected. The station's archive clearance required triple authorization for anything above standard classification, and the Kth response sat several tiers above that. Kara submitted the request and watched, with mounting frustration, as the system returned an error that made no logical sense. Access previously granted. Session terminated by remote authority. "Someone already pulled this file," Kara said slowly, "and closed it before we could see who." Seletha's jaw tightened, tracked the access log. The log, when it finally rendered, told a strange story of its own. The Kth response file had been accessed exactly 4 times in 26 years. Once on the day it was sealed. Once during a records audit 11 years ago that had apparently been cut short. Once, 6 months ago, by a name redacted even from command-level clearance. And once, tonight, roughly 90 seconds before the alarm first sounded, as though someone aboard Meridian 7 had known the ship was come before the scanners ever detected it. "That's not a coincidence," Karath murmured. Someone here already knew. Before Seleth could respond, the tone sounded again, 3 descending notes, and this time, words followed. The voice was calm, unhurried, neither male nor female in any way that mattered, modulated with a kind of careful neutrality that suggested it had been chosen deliberately to avoid triggering whatever cultural assumptions the Coalition might carry about human aggression. "This is a formal communication from the sovereign fleet of Earth. We are not here to attack the station Meridian 7 or any Coalition vessel in this sector. We ask that you do not interpret our approach as hostile. We have come to reclaim what was taken from us. We are not asking your permission. We offer you only the courtesy of knowing that we have returned." The bridge erupted into overlapping voices. Questions, demands for confirmation. Someone shouting for tactical readiness before Seleth silenced the room with a single raised hand. "Reclaim what?" she said, half to herself, half to the humans who couldn't yet hear her. "Reclaim what exactly?" The transmission had already ended. No further explanation followed. The lone human ship continued its unhurried approach, and the 32 vessels at the edge of sensor range held their position, patient as stone, offering nothing more than their presence as a statement. It was Kareth who finally voiced a question no one else wanted to ask aloud. "Commander, what if the file doesn't say what we've always been told it says?" Seleth didn't answer immediately. She turned instead to the station's senior historian, summoned hastily from her quarters and still visibly disoriented by the hour, and asked her directly, "What do you know about the Kth response?" Not the summary, not the anniversary speech. What do you actually know? The historian, a soft-spoken Threnian named Oves who had spent 30 years cataloging Coalition military history, hesitated long enough that the hesitation itself became an answer. "I know," she said carefully, "that every account I've ever cross-referenced describes a conflict differently depending on which archive I pull it from. Military records say humanity was neutralized. Diplomatic records say humanity was contained. And there's a third set, buried under a classification I was never given clearance to open, that uses a word I've only seen once, in a single leaked fragment years ago." "What word?" Seleth asked, though something in her voice suggested she already feared the answer. Oves met her eyes. "Imprisoned." The word landed on the bridge like a dropped weight. No one moved. No one spoke. Kareth felt the static sensation return, stronger now, the same rawness that had woken him for the first alarm. Except now it had a shape, a direction, a horrifying possibility taking form. If humanity hadn't been defeated in open conflict, if humanity hadn't simply vanished, ashamed and broken, into the quiet edges of the galaxy, if instead an entire civilization had been imprisoned, contained against its will, its history sealed not to protect the galaxy from them, but to protect the Coalition from what it had done, then the 32 ships waiting patiently at the edge of the system weren't an invasion force at all. They were a jury. Seleth straightened, forcing her voice back into the measured calm of command, though Kara could see the effort it cost her. "Open a channel," she said. "Let them speak to us directly. It's time we found out exactly what they think we did." As the comms officer moved to comply, the lone human ship completed its final approach and settled into a stable position just outside docking range, close enough to make its intentions unmistakable, far enough to make clear it was choosing restraint, not fear, and on the far edge of the system, without any visible signal passing between them. The 32 waiting ships shifted almost imperceptibly closer together, as though something aboard the lead vessel had just confirmed what it came here to learn. The silence, Kareth realized, had never been surrender. It had been an investigation, and the verdict was about to be delivered. The channel opened cleanly, without static, without delay, exactly as the first transmission had. Seleth straightened her uniform, aware that whatever image the Coalition projected in the next few minutes would likely be remembered for decades. She had trained for battle. She had trained for diplomacy. Nothing in her career had prepared her for a conversation that might determine whether her government stood accused of a crime it had spent 26 years hiding. "This is Commander Seleth of Meridian 7, she said. "We received your transmission. We're listening." There was a pause. Not hesitation, Kara thought, but consideration, as though the humans wanted to be certain their next words landed exactly as intended. "Thank you, Commander," the voice replied, still calm, still unervingly patient. "My name is Representative Vos Idrian, speaking on behalf of the sovereign fleet of Earth. I understand this moment is difficult for you. It has been difficult for us as well, for 26 years. You said you come to reclaim something," Seleth said. "I'd like to understand what exactly you believe was taken." Another pause. When Vos spoke again, there was something different in the tone, not anger, not triumph, but a kind of weary honesty that felt more unsettling than either would have been. "Our people, our territory, our history, and most of all, Commander, the truth. For 26 years your government has told its citizens that humanity was defeated and dispersed after the Kth response. That is not what happened. We were never defeated. We were contained, trapped within a sealed border, cut off from galactic trade, communication, and travel, while your coalition quietly absorbed the systems we had settled and rewrote the history of how that came to be." On the bridge, Oves the historian pressed a hand to her mouth. Kareth watched Seleth's expression carefully, searching for disbelief, and found none. Only the slow, dawning weight of something the commander had perhaps always suspected, but never allowed herself to examine. "That's a serious accusation," Sellers said, choosing her words with visible care. "I won't pretend I have the authority to confirm or deny it, but I also won't pretend the discrepancies in our own archives haven't already troubled me tonight." "We're aware," Voss said. "We've been aware of the discrepancies for 26 years. Commander, we lived inside them." A junior officer near the tactical station leaned toward a colleague and whispered something about scrambling defense fighters, a suggestion that died the instant Sellers turned a sharp look in his direction. The last thing the situation needed was a nervous cadet deciding that 32 patient ships required a hostile answer. "What is it you want from us?" Sellers asked. "Specifically, 3 things," Voss answered, without hesitation, as though the demand had been rehearsed many times across many long years of waiting. First, a public, verified acknowledgement from the coalition government of what actually occurred during the Caith response. Not the sanitized history taught to your children, but the truth drawn from your own sealed files. Second, the immediate lifting of every restriction still quietly imposed on human movement, trade, and communication throughout coalition space. And third, the most difficult, I imagine, an honest accounting, made available to your own citizens, of how that history came to be buried in the first place. "You're not asking for reparations," Sellers said slowly. "You're not asking for territory back or compensation or—" "We are asking for the truth first," Voss said. "Everything else can be negotiated once the truth exists in the open. We've found, Commander, that people who have never been permitted to see clearly cannot be expected to negotiate fairly. We would rather begin with sight than with demands." It was, Kara thought, an almost impossibly reasonable request from a fleet that could, by every visible measure, have simply opened fire and ended the conversation before it began. 32 ships, a single station with modest defenses, and instead of ultimatums backed by weapons, they were asking politely, patiently, for honesty. That patience, Kareth realized with chill, was itself the most alarming part of the entire encounter. An enemy in a hurry could be predicted, contained, outmaneuvered. An enemy willing to wait 26 years for the right moment to ask a simple question was something else entirely. An opponent who had already won the only battle that mattered, the battle of certainty, long before a single weapon was ever raised. Seleth exhaled slowly. "I don't have the authority to grant any of those requests myself. That decision belongs to the Coalition Council." "We understand," Voss said, "which is why we're not asking you to grant them. We're asking you to let 3 of our representatives board your station so that we may present our case to whoever the Council sends to hear it. We would rather speak with open records between us than have this conversation escalate into something neither of us wants." Seleth glanced toward Kareth, toward Oves, toward the tense, uncertain faces filling the bridge, and understood that whatever she chose next would define far more than the fate of one border station. "Send your representatives," she said finally. "Meridian 7 will receive them." The transmission closed with the same eerie calm it had opened with. On the long-range display, 3 small craft detached from the lone human vessel and began a slow, unhurried approach toward the station's docking ring, while behind them, the 32 silent ships remained exactly where they were, watching, waiting, bearing witness to whatever would happen next. Kara stared at the screen and felt, for the first time that night, not fear exactly, but something closer to dread. The dread of a person about to learn that the story they built their whole life around had never been true at all. The docking bay had never felt so small. Kara stood beside Commander Seleth, flanked by a modest honor guard that felt, in this particular moment, less like protection and more like theater, a gesture toward normalcy in a situation that had abandoned normalcy hours ago. Oves the historian hovered nearby. Clutching a data pad she hadn't stopped nervously scrolling through since the negotiations began. When the airlock finally cycled open, the 3 human representatives who stepped through were, in almost every visible way, disappointing anyone who had spent a lifetime imagining humanity as some monstrous, half-remembered threat. They wore simple gray uniforms without ornamentation. They carried no visible weapons. Their expressions held none of the menace Kareth had unconsciously braced for. Only a quiet, careful attentiveness, the look of people entering a room they had thought about entering for a very long time. Voss Idrian, the one who had spoken over the comm channel, stepped forward first. Up close, the voice belonged to a woman perhaps in her 50s, silver threading through dark hair, her eyes moving methodically across the docking bay as though cataloging every detail for a report she'd write later. "Commander Selith," Voss said, extending a hand in a gesture Kara recognized from old cultural archives but had never seen performed in person. "Thank you for receiving us." Selith accepted the handshake, visibly uncertain of the correct response, and gestured toward the small conference room Meridian 7, kept reserved for diplomatic incidents that, until tonight, had never actually occurred. "This way, I requested a secure line to Coalition Council Command. They'll want to hear this directly." As they walked, Kara studied the two representatives flanking Voss, a younger man who introduced himself simply as Tomas, and an older man, silent and watchful, whose name Kara would later learn was Reyes, and who carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone who had survived things he chose not to discuss. Inside the conference room, the atmosphere shifted the moment the door sealed behind them. Whatever careful diplomacy had governed the docking bay gave way, almost immediately, to something rawer. "Before the council joins," Voss said, setting a small data drive on the table, "I'd like to offer you something, Commander, not as a demand, as a courtesy, the same courtesy we've extended since the beginning of this conversation." Selith accepted the drive cautiously. "What is it?" "A copy of our own archive of the Kth response," Voss said, "our side of the sealed history. I suspect it will differ substantially from whatever your government has taught you to believe." Oves, unable to help herself, leaned forward. "May I ask, how did your people preserve this history so completely, if you were truly cut off from galactic communication for 26 years? For the first time, something like genuine emotion crossed Voss's controlled expression. Not anger, but a tired, aching sorrow. Because remembering was the only weapon we had left, historian. When a people are stripped of ships, of trade, of contact with the wider galaxy, memory becomes the last form of resistance available to them. We taught every child born inside the containment zone exactly what had been done to us, and exactly why, so that the truth would survive even if we never did." The words settled heavily over the room. Kara thought of the sanitized history lessons of their own childhood. Humanity as a cautionary tale, a threat rightfully neutralized, and felt something uncomfortable shift beneath that certainty. "You could have attacked," Selith said quietly. 32 ships. You could have opened fire the moment you crossed into restricted space, and this station would have had little chance of stopping you. Why didn't you?" Voss considered the question with evident care before answering. "Because revenge was never the goal. Commander, if we wanted the galaxy to fear us, we could have arrived as conquerors. Instead, we chose to arrive as witnesses. We spent 26 years building, learning, preparing, not for war, but for the moment we would be strong enough to demand the truth without needing to beg for it, and patient enough to demand it without needing to destroy anything to be heard." The door chimed softly, the secure council channel, finally connecting. Selith glanced at the three representatives, then at Kareth, then at the data drive resting on the table between them, containing a version of history the Coalition had spent 26 years trying to erase. "Once this call connects," Selith said quietly, almost to herself, "there's no sealing this back up again." "No," Voss agreed, not unkindly. "There isn't. That's rather the point, Commander." The screen flickered to life, revealing the tense, half-assembled faces of Coalition Council members roused from sleep across a dozen different systems, none of them yet aware of exactly how much their evening was about to change. Selith took a breath, glanced once more at the silent, watchful representatives seated across from her, and began to speak, knowing that whatever she said next would be remembered as the moment the galaxy's carefully maintained silence finally broke. The Council's reaction, when it came, was exactly as chaotic as Selith had feared. Voices overlapped across the secure channel, demands for verification, accusations of fabrication. At least one counselor insisting the entire encounter was an elaborate hoax staged by a rival faction. Voss Idrian sat through the outburst without visible frustration, waiting with the same patience that had carried the Sovereign fleet through 26 years of silence. It was Oves who finally cut through the noise, holding up the data drive Voss had provided. Counselors, before you dismiss this as fabrication, I'd ask you to authorize emergency cross-reference clearance. Let me compare their archive against our own sealed case response file in real time on this channel, where everyone can see the results as they come in. A tense silence followed before the council, less out of trust and out of growing fear of being caught concealing something worse than doubt, granted the authorization. What followed was, for Kareth, the longest 20 minutes of the entire night. Oves worked methodically, pulling fragments from both archives side by side, translating dense military terminology into plain language for the room. The Coalition's official record described the case response as a defensive action taken after a human colony fleet allegedly violated a disputed border, prompting a measured containment response that ended hostilities within weeks. The human archive told a different story entirely, one supported, disturbingly, by internal Coalition logistics records buried so deep in the seal file that even Oves hadn't known they existed. According to those records, the disputed border had been redrawn unilaterally by the Coalition itself, mere months before the incident, absorbing 3 systems humanity had legally settled decades earlier. When human diplomats objected through proper channels, those objections were quietly filed and ignored. When a small human patrol fleet moved to assert its original territorial claim, not an invasion but a protest, the Coalition responded with overwhelming force, not to repel an attack, but to make an example. They didn't defend the border. Oves said quietly, reading the final fragment aloud, her voice unsteady. They erased one and then punished the people who noticed. The silence that followed on the council channel was unlike any Kareth had heard all night. Not the calculated silence of the human fleet, but the stunned, guilty silence of people confronted with a truth they had built careers and possibly entire lives around not knowing. The containment order, Voss said quietly, breaking the quiet herself, sealed every human colony behind a communications and trade blockade that lasted 26 years. Ships that tried to leave returned back, or in the earliest years, disabled. Entire generations of our people were born, lived, and in some cases died, never once seeing the wider galaxy their grandparents had freely traveled. We were not defeated in the case response, counselors. We were punished for objecting to theft, and then hidden away so no one would ever ask why. One of the counselors, visibly shaken, finally spoke. If this is true, and I want to be very clear, we will need extensive independent verification. Why come now? Why not 26 years ago, the moment the blockade was imposed? Voss's answer carried the weight of every one of those 26 years. Because a wounded people demanding justice too early is easily dismissed as a wounded people demanding revenge. We chose instead to become something the galaxy could not simply wave away, a civilization strong enough to be taken seriously, patient enough to arrive without violence, and thorough enough to bring proof rather than accusations. We did not come tonight to punish you, counselors. We came because we were finally ready to be believed. Kareth, standing quietly near the edge of the room, found themselves thinking not of politics or council authority, but of every history lesson absorbed without question throughout childhood. Humanity as villain, humanity as cautionary tale, humanity as a threat rightfully silenced for the galaxy's own good. It had never once occurred to Kareth to ask who had written that lesson, or why. Reyes, silent through most of the exchange, finally spoke for first time, his voice ruffled a restraint that suggested decades of carefully swallowed anger. My daughter was born inside the blockade. She died inside it too, 11 years ago, having never once seen a sky that wasn't rationed, filtered, or monitored by systems that treated her existence as a security risk. I am not here for apologies, counselors. Apologies do not give her back the sky. I am here because the next child born of my people deserves better than a lie you told about why her grandmother's world was taken. No one on the council spoke for a long moment. Even the counselor who had dismissed the encounter as a hoax sat motionless, unable to summon further objection. Selith finally broke the silence, her voice quiet but resolute. Counselors, I recommend we do exactly what Representative Voss has asked. Verify the archive. Acknowledge what it shows, and begin the process of undoing 26 years of restrictions built on a lie we told ourselves so thoroughly we forgot it was ever a lie at all. The council chamber, for the first time all night, offered no argument. The formal negotiations began 3 days later, aboard Meridian 7, under conditions no diplomat in coalition history had ever managed before. Full transparency, open record, and the quiet, watchful presence of 32 human ships still holding their position at the edge of the system, a silent reminder that patience, once spent, does not simply disappear. Kareth attended as a witness rather than participant, standing near the same conference room where Voss Idrian had first laid a data drive on the table and asked, gently, for nothing more than the truth. In the days since, that request had rippled outward across a dozen systems, cracking open archives, ending careers, and forcing an entire generation of coalition citizens to confront a history far uglier than the one they'd been taught to recite from memory. Not everyone accepted it easily. On the second day of negotiations, a mid-ranking coalition intelligence officer named Farrell attempted to disrupt the proceedings entirely, smuggling a corrupted data packet into the station's archive system in a desperate, ultimately clumsy attempt to reseal portions of the Caith response file before independent verification could complete. He was caught within hours, not by coalition security, but by Oves herself, who had spent the better part 3 sleepless nights building redundant backups specifically because she no longer trusted anyone, including her own government, to protect the truth once it was finally exposed. Farrell's arrest, rather than derailing the negotiations, seemed only to confirm everything the human delegation had suspected about the culture concealment they were up against, and, paradoxically, seemed to earn the coalition a small measure of credibility for handling the betrayal openly rather than quietly burying it, as the old coalition might once have done. "You're only proving my point," Voss observed dryly, watching security escort the disgraced officer away. "The instinct to hide inconvenient truths runs deep in your institutions. Commander, it will take more than one honest week to undo 26 years of practiced silence." "Then we'll need more than one honest week," Seleth replied. "But we'll start with this one." The formal coalition acknowledgement came on the 5th day, a public broadcast, unprecedented in its candor, admitting that the Caith response had not been a defensive action, but an unlawful land seizure, followed by a punitive, decades-long containment of an entire civilization. The broadcast did not undo 26 years of loss. It could not return the childhood spent behind a blockade, or the sky Reyes' daughter never lived to see freely. But it did something the sovereign fleet had waited 26 patient years to witness. It made the lie impossible to maintain any longer. In the weeks that followed, the practical work began. Trade restrictions lifted, travel corridors reopened, reparations negotiations launched under independent oversight, and, perhaps most significantly, a joint coalition human historical commission established to ensure no future generation on either side would grow up believing a story convenient enough to erase an entire people's suffering. Kareth found themselves in a quiet moment near the end of the formal proceedings, standing beside Voss Idrian at the observation deck of Meridian 7, watching the 32 ships finally begin their slow withdrawal from the edge of the system. Not in retreat, but in the unhurried manner of witnesses whose testimony had finally been heard. "Can I ask you something?" Kareth said. "All those years waiting, preparing, remembering, didn't you ever want to simply attack? Make us pay the way you've been made to pay?" Voss considered the question for a long moment, watching her fleet drift homeward against the stars. "There were people among us who wanted exactly that, officer. Every year we waited, that argument grew louder. But we understood something the coalition never seemed to grasp about us, that a people remembered as monsters, even monsters with justified grievances, will always be contained again eventually. We didn't want to win a war. We wanted to end a lie. Violence would have only given your council a new, more comfortable story to tell. Humanity, dangerous after all, rightfully feared. So you chose patience instead," Kareth said. "We chose to become undeniable," Voss corrected gently. "There's a difference. Patience alone accomplishes nothing. Patience combined with preparation and memory sharp enough to survive 26 years of silence, that accomplishes everything." Kareth thought of the sealed files, the redrawn borders, the quiet, decades-long assumption that silence from civilization always meant defeat, never restraint. It was a lesson the coalition would be reckoning with for years to come, in classrooms and council chambers and quiet family conversations about grandparents who had once been taught to fear a monster that had never actually existed. As the last of the human fleet slipped beyond sensor range, leaving only the negotiating team's single vessel still docked at Meridian 7, Kara allowed themselves, finally, to ask the question that had haunted the station since the very first alarm sounded 3 days earlier, the question the entire galaxy would now spend years trying honestly to answer. For 26 years, the Coalition had told itself a comforting story about a dangerous people successfully contained, and had slept soundly believing the danger had passed. But watching the stars where 32 patient ships had waited unseen for exactly the right moment to finally be heard, Kara understood the far more unsettling truth now written permanently into the record. It had never been humanity trapped behind that quiet, 26-year silence. It had been the Coalition's own fear of what it had done, contained all along, inside a lie it told so well it had almost believed it forever.